I've never been a man prone to superstition. My work as an investigative journalist taught me to pursue evidence, cold data, patterns that can withstand the fog of emotion. But nothing I experienced in Inverbrae fits any rational mold. None of it should exist. If this story already unsettles you, maybe you should subscribe to the channel. Trust me, the revelations ahead are far more disturbing. The first time I heard of the Hartwell family was by chance, during a hushed conversation in the back of a pub in Edinburgh. Two elderly men, clearly drunk, were whispering about a cursed house where children went and were never seen again. At first I ignored it, but when one of them dropped an old photograph on the counter, a yellowed image of 6 children lined up in front of a stone mansion wrapped in fog, all staring blankly at the camera, something inside me froze. On the back, a firm handwritten note: The Little Hartwells, summer of 1958. The village of Inverbrae lies over 75 miles from any major city, a cluster of damp houses surrounded by mist-covered hills that rarely clear. When I arrived, I immediately noticed the discomfort in people's eyes when I mentioned the name Hartwell. Averted gazes, silences that stretched too long. One woman even crossed herself before telling me, "Some stories are better left buried where they were told." Still, I pressed on. I always do. The Hartwell mansion sat at the northern edge of the village, isolated among dead fields and wind-twisted trees. A 3-story Victorian structure with arched windows and Gothic doors that seemed to watch you as you approached. Weeds consumed the garden, and the iron gate creaked as if protesting the presence of any outsider. Before stepping out of my rented car, I took the photograph out once more. I compared the windows, the staircase, the old stone bench in front of the house. It matched. This was the place. And if the archived records were correct, the Hartwells had fostered 6 children between the years of 1955 and 1963 through a now-defunct adoption program called the New Seed Society. None of those children were ever officially listed as deceased, but neither were they heard from again. No letters, no visits, no burials, just silence. The strangest part? There was never an official investigation, only vague mentions in local archives, as if the entire village had decided to forget, as if they had collectively erased everything, except the house. The first night I entered, there was no electricity. The windows were boarded, and the stairs groaned beneath my feet as if protesting my presence. In the main hall, I found portraits covered in gray cloths, an empty bookshelf save for a single volume, Cycles of Rebirth, Rituals of Essence Preservation, published in 1898, and a smell of dampness mixed with something metallic, something faintly sweet, like rust and dead flowers. There were marks on the floor, as if furniture had been dragged repeatedly in the same pattern. Above the fireplace was a partially cracked crest, a circle with an inward spiral, and in the center, a lotus flower turned upside down. It was the same symbol printed in the lower right corner of the photograph I found in the pub. Coincidence? I no longer believed in coincidences. Later that night, while reviewing my notes back at the village's only inn, I noticed the date on the back of the photograph matched exactly with the new moon of that year. I began listing every name I could find in the village records, every passing mention of the New Seed Society, every appearance of the cryptic emblem. A pattern slowly emerged, like something ancient awakening beneath the soil. But there was one constant: the Hartwells, always at the center, and 6 erased names, 6 quiet vanishings, 6 times the same forgotten story. What happened in that house was more than neglect or abandonment. It was meticulous, ritualistic, and the deeper I dug, the stronger the feeling grew. I was being watched. I inherited the Hartwell estate in the fall of 1997, unexpectedly, when the last living member of the family passed away under suspicious circumstances. My name is Michael Hartwell, and although I had lived my entire life in Boston, I never expected the old family name to resurface in such a way. The phone call, that is a moment I replay over and over. A lawyer in Inverbrae informed me that I was the sole surviving heir, no known siblings, no will beyond the vaguest clause mentioning his distant kin. I remember the date clearly. It was the 15th day of October, 1997, a mid-autumn drizzle dripping from the eaves of the law office as he spoke. By the time I arrived in Inverbrae, it was the 3rd of November, 1997. The flight from Logan Airport was long, and upon leaving Glasgow International, I drove through winding roads covered by a blanket of fog. When I reached the village, twilight had already claimed the hills, and the houses looked like silent sentinels in the mist. I carried only a small suitcase and the sense that I was walking into a dream I should have never woken to. The lawyer handed me the deeds jutting across his bulky oak desk. They were brittle, stained, some bound in leather with seals from centuries past. One document was dated the 30th day of September, 1935, a transfer of trust from one Thomas Hartwell II to his son, Thomas Hartwell III. It included a peculiar clause in Latin, which when translated read, Lux aeterna ex sanguine perennis, eternal light through perpetual blood. Even then, I felt a chill. The estate spanned 5 acres of overgrown grounds, the mansion itself looming on a small rise. I approached it on a crisp November morning when frost still sparkled on the grass, skeletal branches creaking in the breeze. The gate, left ajar, groaned an invitation I scarcely wanted to accept. Yet I stepped through. Inside, the air was cold and oppressive. Dust motes danced in shafts of pale light, and a grand staircase curved upward like a spine. I set down boxes containing my clothing in what I recognized, by virtue of family photographs, as the study. The walls were lined with old portraits of Hartwells through the centuries, men and women with the same angular jawline, piercing eyes, an identical brooch bearing the spiral lotus crest pinned on each coat. I noted dates carved below each frame. Thomas Hartwell I, born 1872, his son, born 1895, and so on, each generation spaced by roughly 25 to 30 years. That crest repeated in every frame like a silent oath. That afternoon I wandered the grounds and discovered an outbuilding that had once served as a carriage house. Inside, beneath rotting hay, was a chest containing leather-bound journals tied in faded ribbon. My hands shook as I opened the earliest volume, penned by a Thomas Hartwell, later identified from the handwriting as the third, dated the 22nd of October, 1935. He wrote about dreams of longevity. Through the cycle of sacrifice under the new moon, our line shall endure beyond mortal decay. There it was, ritual language etched in personal passion. Within the same chest, I found a second journal belonging to someone named Eleanor Hartwell, dated 12 August, 1955, the day after the first child arrived under foster. She wrote, "He is here now, the little one with storm-gray eyes. We must begin when the moon is new. For every cycle, the essence must be gathered." These words pierced me. The first child, the herald of the series. I felt the weight of 6 arrivals and their eventual vanishings. That evening I returned indoors and tiptoed up to the locked room at the end of the hallway, the only door barred with an iron latch. With 2 kitchen knives wedged into the lock and a breath held tight in my lungs, I managed to force it open. Inside was a narrow chamber, walls lined with stone, floor cold beneath my feet. In the center sat an altar of rough granite, stained a dark red. On it lay dried petals, bone fragments, and a tarnished silver chalice etched with the spiral lotus crest. I closed my eyes and felt my pulse pound like a warning. I spent the next fortnight carefully examining every corner of the house. I cataloged rooms left untouched, boxes of unsent letters, invoices from orphanages, photographs with faces scratched out. In one drawer I discovered 6 identical tokens, small brass coins stamped with Roman numeral 13, and the spiral lotus crest on the reverse side. On the back of each envelope containing those tokens was a name in cursive: Thomas, Sarah, Edward, Margaret, Joseph, Clara, the 6 foster children. What unsettled me most were the blank pages at the end of each journal. After their names appeared, no entries followed. It was as if the writer stopped, mid-pen stroke, when the child disappeared. I began searching local archives, contacting former villagers. I learned the foster children had arrived one each in the years 1955 through 1963, always during the new moon cycle. No records of schooling exist, no baptismal records. In every case, silence followed. Then, one cold evening in mid-November, I encountered Mrs. Penelope Fraser, almost 90 years old, who had lived in Inverbrae her entire life. Her memory began with trembling decades. "I remember the little girl Margaret," she whispered. "She was sweet." And then, nothing. She made the sign of the cross and added, "I could never speak. I feared them." Even her voice trembled at the name Hartwell. Another witness, Robert McLean, a former groundskeeper, told me he'd seen shadows moving in candlelight in the carriage house late at night. He said, "It looked like children, but just silhouettes." At the new moon, when I pressed him, he stared at me with wet eyes and said, "They were calling names." My God, they were calling names in that old tongue. Each detail confirmed the same pattern. A cycle repeated 6 times, meticulous in timing, coordinated through generations by the Hartwells. The journals, the tokens marked with Roman numeral 13, the crest, the new moon timing, all tied into some arcane mythology I could not yet fully grasp. But for now, I was a lone outsider in my own legacy. I had the estate in my hands, but the meaning behind it, the purpose of the rituals, remained obscured by gaps in the journals and frightened memories. And as I sat in the study at midnight, candle flickering, I noticed for the first time footsteps echoing in the hallway above. A soft scrape, pause, then retreat. I felt that presence again, not just in the house but outside, watching, waiting, hidden. That was the beginning of the discovery. A slow unraveling, one piece at a time, layer by layer, each clue planted like a seed in the dark, and I was harvesting fear. It was during my second month in the Hartwell estate that the true nature of what had occurred began to emerge, not through voices or dreams, but through paper, forgotten paper, hidden, burned, buried, and tucked between floorboards. It began with the study's false panel, a warped wooden plank behind the lowest shelf of the south wall. Behind it was a locked tin box, and inside that, 73 documents, each one stained, some torn, several signed in blood-red ink. The first was a ledger, undated but likely from the early 1930s, detailing incoming charges with initials and dates beside them. Each entry was annotated with 2 columns, Phase 1, Extraction, and Phase 2, Return. Under Return, every line was crossed out. The names were coded, but the dates correlated with the arrival years of the foster children. One note simply read, Subject M, Phase 1 complete, resistance minimal, awaiting lunar clearance. Another document appeared to be an internal memo from the New Seed Society, dated the 5th of May, 1955. Phase renewal. All Hartwell sites must adhere strictly to the ritual timeline. The new moon aligns with the 13th spiral cycle. Prepare essence vessels in advance. No deviation will be tolerated. Signed, The Sour. That alias appeared often. The Sour, a title perhaps, or a role assumed across generations. In the main corridor upstairs, I uncovered 6 portraits veiled in black cloth, their faces carved out with a blade. Only the bodies remained. Small hands, stiff collars, dim outlines of toys in their laps. On the back of one frame, a pencil note in near-faded script read, Margaret, before the calling, age 8. Behind another frame, hidden under the canvas, was a page torn from a diary. October the 29th, 1957. She is gone. Margaret stood so still before the altar. Her voice was calm when she asked if the stars would remember her. Thomas said she was ready. I wanted to scream, but I remembered the oath. Blood for light, 6 for the bloom. I began to suspect there had been a complicit silence within the family. Not one, but many had taken part. In the attic, I found a trunk that had likely belonged to Eleanor Hartwell, tucked behind the remains of an old dollhouse. Inside were children's drawings, crude crayon depictions of the house, of figures robed in black, of a spiral symbol drawn again and again. One drawing showed 6 stick figures inside a circle, surrounded by 13 petals. At the center stood a figure with a lotus on its head, written beneath in childish scrawl, "The Bloom Father watches." At this point, I had begun pinning photos and documents across the walls of the study. Patterns emerged, not just in names and dates, but in repetitions. Always the new moon, always 6, always the same months, October through December, and always a symbol, etched into fireplace stone, sewn into pillowcases, stamped on envelopes, embroidered on a quilt I found in the basement, faded and stained with something too dark to be wine. One of the most disturbing discoveries came from beneath the cellar floor. I had noticed that one portion of the concrete felt slightly elevated. With a hammer and chisel, I chipped it away and found a compartment containing what looked like municipal records, sealed in wax, hidden from any public archive. Among them was a birth certificate from 1951 belonging to a girl named Sarah Elmsworth, renamed Sarah Hartwell, in a handwritten notation. A stamp marked Relocated Society of the New Seed crossed the document. There were 5 more like it, all children originally born to poor families, taken in as orphans and passed quietly into the Hartwell home. A second letter, dated November 19, 1959, bore the following lines. To the Council of Keepers, Subject E has begun resistance. He speaks of his mother. We suggest preliminary sedation before ceremony. Ensure the chalice remains sealed post-collection. His cycle completes under Roman numeral 3. That number haunted everything. Roman numeral 13, over and over. One evening, I discovered a diary behind a brick in the fireplace, smaller than the others, bound in red leather. It belonged to someone not of the family. The first page simply read, My name was Clara. I was 9. The final entry was dated December 3, 1963. There's a room under the altar. They don't think I know, but I've seen it. There are stairs behind the wine rack. Every child ends there. The sour wears no face. His mouth is too wide. If I disappear, tell someone. Please, tell anyone. I wept reading that. I knew Clara had never left. Her drawing was among the others. Her token, found later in a desk drawer, bore her name, her date, and the Roman numeral 13. I began sleeping with the journals beside me, as if the proximity might offer protection. The whispers in the walls had grown louder. I told myself it was the wind, the pipes, the age of the house. But I heard names: Thomas, Sarah, Edward, Margaret, Joseph, Clara, spoken low, dragged across the floorboards like breath made of dust. One night, while reviewing a photograph from 1938, a family gathering of Hartwells on the lawn, I noticed a blurred figure in the background. Not a guest, but a child standing apart, watching. Her dress was an older style, out of place even for the time. I magnified the photo and saw her eyes, hollow, etched with something impossible. I wrote down all dates and symbols in a master timeline. Every 28 years, another Hartwell cycle seemed to begin, and the final clue came when I found a folded map inside one of the books. Cycles of rebirth, rituals of essence preservation. It showed 13 dots arranged in a spiral across the grounds. I realized these were not random landscaping notes. They were burial markers. I walked the estate with that map and found indentations in the earth. Each site contained the same formation: stone, ash, rusted coins with the spiral crest, and fragments of children's clothing. One grave had a small porcelain shoe. This was no longer inheritance. This was infestation, and something was still being fed. I reached a point where the silence within the house became indistinguishable from the silence outside of it, as if Inverbrae itself had grown thick with the same mold that covered the Hartwell estate, ancient, humid, and quietly feeding on whatever remained unspoken. I decided to take the investigation beyond the gates. My first stop was the Inverbrae Municipal Archives, housed in a squat gray building at the village center. The clerk on duty, a man in his 60s named Colin Drew, greeted me with cautious politeness. When I mentioned I was researching the Hartwells, the corners of his eyes twitched. "Plenty of family records up in Section C," he said, gesturing vaguely, "but some years are missing. Not my fault." In Section C, I found evidence not just of neglect, but of deliberate omission. The adoption records from 1955 through 1963 were absent, not mislabeled, removed. Their serial numbers skipped entire sequences. Death registries showed spikes in unrecorded child fatalities in the region. Cause of death, unknown. Some entries were filed under blank names, but more telling was a sealed file, half-burned at the edges, misfiled among agricultural documents. Inside, internal correspondence between municipal officials and the Society of the New Seed. One letter, dated November 6, 1957, read, "The presence of the bloom must not be questioned. Hartwell ground is sanctified. We recommend relocation of the complainant's child to avoid duplication. You will be compensated." Signed once again by the Sower. It was not just a family secret, it was community policy. That night I interviewed Mrs. Ada Morell, now 88, a former midwife who had served Inverbrae for nearly 4 decades. I found her in a care facility on the outskirts of town, surrounded by soft music and the smell of bleach. When I showed her one of the erased portraits, she recoiled. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. But after I promised anonymity and turned off the recorder, she confessed. There were always children being misplaced. We were told they were adopted by good people, but we never saw them again, not even once. And the Hartwells, well, they had a way of making people forget, or stay quiet. She paused, staring at her trembling hands. I delivered 3 of the 6 myself, but I was only allowed in the house once. After that, they brought the children to me, already altered somehow, quieter, like they'd seen something they shouldn't have. At the local Inverbrae Sentinel office, closed decades ago but still cluttered with yellowed drafts, I found unpublished articles from 1961. One piece, written by a journalist named Peter Mallory, was titled "The Spiral Truth: What Lies Beneath the Hartwell Legacy." It was never printed. His notes revealed he had tracked down several of the foster children's biological families. One mother, Mary Elmsworth, had begged for help after her daughter Sarah vanished from the Hartwell home, but the article was stamped, "Killed, do not publish." Below it, a typewritten annotation read, "Article interferes with protected ritual property under Section 3 of the Private Heritage Agreement. Suppression authorized by Regional Review Board. Councillor A. Dunn." Councillor A. Dunn had served Inverbrae until 1974. His death was ruled an accident. falling from the clock tower, but Mrs. Morell insisted off the record that he had become unstable. He was found clutching a brass token with the spiral crest and the number 13 scratched into the floor beside him. The web was growing, and each name I traced ended either in silence or something worse. One man, Graham Tully, had been a schoolteacher in the 1960s. He remembered registering Thomas Hartwell IV as a guardian for a student named Edward, but the child never attended class. I asked once, Graham told me, just once. They sent a letter the next day, saying the boy had been moved for private tutelage, except the handwriting was the same as one I received a decade earlier. Different child, same ink, same words. Graham showed me a collection of envelopes, all marked with wax seals bearing the spiral lotus crest. One was postmarked December 1st, 1963, the day Clara was last seen. Another source, Father Leon Macabre, retired priest of the now-defunct St. Ewan's Church, offered his own fragmented memories. They used the crypts, he said, the old family tombs beneath the chapel. I remember being told never to enter after dusk. One night, I heard singing, low, humming chants. When I asked, they said it was the wind. Father Macabre handed me a fragment of an old missal torn from his prayer book. On the back, written in what appeared to be charcoal, we plant, so the cycle turns. The spiral blooms where blood flows in silence. The 13th will rise when the others are gone. Every element of this case, every family member, every villager, every child, was tied into the same doctrine. The cycle, the essence, the blooming spiral. Then came a breakthrough I had not expected. While interviewing Janet Cromley, a former postal worker who handled deliveries to the estate during the early 70s, she recalled something chilling. There was always one envelope that had to be handed directly to the housekeeper. No mailbox. Heavy. Smelled like herbs. Sealed with a gold wax. She kept one envelope. She had never opened it. Inside, a folded parchment with a ritual calendar covering lunar phases for 28 years. Highlighted dates aligned with every disappearance I'd mapped. At the bottom, prepare the root child. Cycle the 13 begins anew. October 3rd, 1997. That was the day the final Hartwell passed. The day I was contacted. It was never inheritance. It was succession. And now the 13th name was mine. It was on the night of December 2nd, 13 days after the final clue arrived, and 13 nights into the new moon's cycle, that the house compelled me to descend. Not with a whisper, not with a scream, with stillness. That unnatural stillness that comes before a storm no one dares name. I had followed every scrap of evidence to its edge. The map in the ritual calendar led me to the wine cellar, long sealed behind crumbling stone. The rack was false. Its shelves swung outward on rusted hinges, revealing a narrow stairwell spiraling into the earth, steep and foul with damp. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, and I felt something pull behind my ribs, like a string unspooling backward through generations. Each step downward erased the noise of the world above. I counted 113 stone steps. At the base, a corridor of stone. Carved into the walls were names, each child, each date, followed by a strange glyph, a spiral inside a spiral, and a line bisecting them vertically. I recognized the 6th name, Clara, December 3rd, 1963. Beyond that, a door of iron, marked with the lotus spiral and gold leaf. I pushed it open. The chamber was a dome of black stone 20 feet across, its walls etched with vines, moons, and symbols that pulsed faintly under the light. In the center, a raised platform, altar-shaped, flanked by 13 candle holders. 7 were melted down to nubs. 6 remained untouched. Above it, embedded in the ceiling, was a mechanism. Stone rings interlocked in spiral formation, forming the emblem I had seen so many times. Around the base, bone fragments, shattered urns, and a ring of dried blood. There were books, bound in skin-like parchment, stacked in alcoves. I dared open only one. It bore no title. The first page simply read, Cycle 13 begins anew. The root child must awaken. For every 6 offered, the sower shall return. Essence is not lost. It is planted. It was then I understood. The Hartwells were not merely participants in a rite. They were gardeners. Their bloodline existed to sow. Each generation provided 6 blooms, children taken not for slaughter alone, but for transformation. Their essence, as the texts called it, was distilled in ritual, gathered in the chalice, consumed by the sower. And the sower was no deity. It was a role, a vessel, A ritual actor prepared across generations to receive the concentrated energy of those 6 cycles. A Hartwell always rose as the 13th. Their body became the soil. I staggered back, nauseated. Then I saw the coffin at the far wall, not empty. Inside, wrapped in cloth and pressed with tokens, was a body. Male, my age, my face, but older. The eyes were sewn shut. In its chest, a cavity where the heart had been replaced by the spiral emblem cast in iron. Beneath it, a brass plate reading, Thomas Hartwell V, prepared for bloom, cycle 13. I collapsed. I wept. My great-grandfather had built this room. My grandfather had used it. My father, long estranged and presumed dead, had perhaps been it. I realized with dawning horror that the 13th child was never meant to vanish. He was meant to stay, to remain and contain, to become. And now that I had returned, drawn back by blood, by inheritance, by the vacancy, I had walked willingly into the role prepared for me across a century. A low hum filled the chamber. I turned to run, but the stairs behind me had closed. The wine rack above had rotated shut, a counterweight triggered by time. I screamed into the stone. I clawed at it. Then, from the walls, whispers, not language, names: Margaret, Sarah, Clara, Edward, Joseph, Thomas, then one more, Michael. The candles lit themselves one by one. I backed against the altar. In a final desperate act, I lifted the chalice. Inside, a viscous black liquid. My reflection stared back. For a moment the surface shifted, and I saw all 6 children behind me, faces pale, eyes wide, not accusing, not forgiving. The stone floor below the altar trembled, and part of it sank, revealing a spiral stair descending further, narrower, carved into raw earth. I followed. Something stronger than fear drove me now. A need to understand. A compulsion older than my own body. The tunnel below curved tightly and pulsed with heat. The walls were engraved with 13 cycles, each spiral larger than the last, alongside depictions of children in fetal positions, surrounded by vines. Blood channels were carved into the floor, leading to a pit in the center of what could only be described as a root chamber. 13 roots, petrified and branching, emerged from the floor like veins. Beneath the pit, I found urns, one for each child, labeled in that same calligraphy. Inside them, strands of hair, fingernails, milk teeth, bloodied cloth, sacrifices preserved across decades. One final alcove held a mirror, backed in obsidian. In its reflection, I did not see myself, but a figure wearing the same brooch I had found in every portrait. A man with my face, but centuries older. The 13th Hartwell. The sour. He lifted his hand in the reflection. I did the same. I was no longer watching. I was being watched. Suddenly, the chamber pulsed with sound. Not air, not vibration. Something inside my skull, reverberating. I dropped the chalice. The liquid splattered over the symbols. They ignited, not with flame, but with memory. I saw all 6 children, bound in ritual, each one lowered onto the altar by family, Hartwell hands. And then I saw the spiral bloom open like a flower, and from its core, the 13th. Each time, he returned. Each time, he looked like me. I emerged from the chamber just before dawn, my clothes soaked in soil, in old blood, in fear. The stairway had reopened sometime in the night, as if acknowledging that my role had changed, that I was no longer an intruder, but something else, something claimed. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I returned to the study, stacked every journal, document, and photograph I had uncovered. I spent 3 full days scanning them, uploading every image to an encrypted drive, preparing a report for national media, independent journalists, and 2 human rights organizations in Edinburgh and London. On the 4th morning, December 6th, I left Inverbrae. I traveled directly to Glasgow, where I presented everything to Inspector Alastair Fenwick, a skeptic by nature, but not a fool. He reviewed my evidence, especially the sealed municipal correspondences and journal entries referencing child removals, and agreed to launch a formal inquiry. His words, "If even a fraction of this is true, it's the most extensive case of intergenerational ritual abuse in British history." By December 10th, a multi-agency task force had arrived in Inverbrae. They cordoned off the Hartwell estate. Dogs were brought in, forensic archaeologists, historians, anthropologists. Within 24 hours, they had uncovered the burial markers indicated in the spiral map. Beneath each marker, remains, partial skeletons, decayed fabric, brass tokens with the spiral lotus emblem, and the number 13 etched by hand. Public reaction was swift and violently polarized. Some denounced it all as a hoax. Others demanded justice for crimes that spanned decades. Headlines swept across Europe. The spiral of silence. 6 children vanished, 1 bloodline to blame. Thomas Hartwell and the Seed Society. The ritual that lasted a century. New moon, cult in rural Scotland. Ancestral death farm uncovered. But Inverbrae remained quiet. Too quiet. Inspector Fenwick attempted to question the remaining elders of the town, including Penelope Fraser and Ada Morell, but both had vanished from their care homes. Their rooms left tidy, bedding smooth, no note. Only a single object was found, a cloth patch embroidered with the spiral and a lotus upside down. Meanwhile, the team inside the estate reached the root chamber. They documented everything: the altar, the bone fragments, the urns. The Hartwell name became synonymous with hidden atrocity. By mid-January, a demolition order had been filed, but on the day the machines arrived, January 13th, exactly 6 weeks after my descent, the entire village of Inverbrae stood between the gates and the bulldozers, not shouting, not holding signs, just standing, dozens of them, silent, eyes blank, wearing pins shaped like spirals. The demolition team refused to proceed. Fenwick called for backup, but the villagers did not budge. When police finally escorted them away, 7 of them collapsed simultaneously, suffering what doctors later called acute neurogenic shock. One of them, Robert McLean, the old groundskeeper, whispered with his dying breath, "The 13th must remain. If uprooted, the bloom dies." Then, the rot spreads. The demolition was postponed indefinitely. News coverage faded. The world moved on, but I didn't. I received anonymous emails containing fragments of documents I had never seen, scans of Hartwell property transfers dating back to the 17th century, notes from other seed sites in Wales, Cornwall, and northern France, all signed with the same glyph, the spiral, the lotus, the number 13. One email read, "In every generation, 6 must be buried for the 13th to contain the root. If the cycle breaks, it blooms outward." On February 13th, a fire consumed the Inverbrae Municipal Archive. Arson was suspected. No arrests made. 2 weeks later, Inspector Fenwick suffered a fatal stroke during a press briefing. The last words he was reported to have spoken, "He's not done." And I fled. I fled to the United States. I changed my name. I buried the flash drives. But it follows me. In every mirror, I see him. The 13th, the sour, me. The Hartwell estate may have been sealed off, and the chamber beneath it abandoned to silence, but what had been unearthed could not be reburied. In the months that followed the initial exposure of the Inverbrae rituals, the phenomenon rippled far beyond the boundaries of a forgotten Scottish village. What began as a localized horror soon bloomed outward, just as the doctrine warned. It was not just a Hartwell tradition. It was a doctrine seeded across generations and geographies. The Royal Commission for Historical Crimes Against Children, hastily assembled in March of the following year, launched a review of orphanage records between the years 1940 and 1980 across the United Kingdom. What they uncovered was staggering. At least 13 orphanage facilities listed children who had been relocated to private spiritual retreats between the months of October and December. None of those children were heard from again. Every one of those files was marked with the same wax insignia, a spiral. Inside the commission, a subcommittee was formed to investigate symbolic child harvest patterns. That phrase alone triggered a storm of controversy. The public called it conspiracy. Religious groups condemned it as heresy. Political leaders deflected, but the documents spoke louder than denials. A high-profile leak published in The Guardian in April revealed over 100 sealed files, some dating as far back as 1872, linking aristocratic families to what internal memoranda referred to as cycle-observant sites. At least 9 family names appeared more than once, not just Hartwell, but Velcroft, Sunningham, Dreslin, Ashby, each with documented ties to the Society of the New Seed, and each showing matching cycles of 6 children vanishing over intervals of 28 years. In France, local newspapers reported the discovery of a similar chamber beneath the ruins of an estate in Brittany. An altar, 13 candle holders, spiral engravings. The authorities sealed the site immediately, but leaked photos circulated online. Experts verified the symbolism is consistent with the Inverbrae chamber. In Germany, records of a private sanatorium outside Leipzig indicated the presence of an essence cult. As early as 1912, there too 6 children disappeared under the care of a noble family with long-standing British ties. The blooming spiral, once a metaphor in obscure journals, had become a proper noun. By July, new laws were proposed across the UK and parts of the EU regarding the preservation and re-examination of closed orphanage records. The public demanded transparency. Survivors of unrelated child abuse scandals now stepped forward, many claiming they had once seen the symbol, on robes, on books, on coins, and still, the official line was careful, too careful. For every documentary produced, a key segment was redacted. For every journalist that investigated deeper, one vanished from social media. And always, the same image returned. A spiral, a lotus, the number 13. Meanwhile, the people of Inverbrae spoke less and less. The town slowly emptied. Shops closed. A report from a traveler in September described the village as eerily quiet, with black drapes over many windows, and townsfolk wearing no expressions at all. The Hartwell estate was technically condemned, but no demolition crew would return. One local MP, following a parliamentary inquiry, claimed, "What began as a ritual ended as infrastructure." This was never about faith, it was about control. These families were never isolated. They were a network, a cultivation. The term essence cultivation entered popular discourse. Conspiracy theorists exploded online. Forums dubbed it the 13th Doctrine. Some saw the sour as a myth, others as metaphor. But those who had stood in the chamber knew better. I remained in hiding. New identities, burner phones. I never stayed in one place longer than 13 nights. I kept the journals encrypted across 13 drives. But sometimes even that wasn't enough. In New Mexico, a researcher contacted me. A woman named Camille Rivera. She had traced a similar pattern of child disappearances to a region near Santa Fe. 6 children, 28 years apart. A ritual site in a desert cave with dried petals and rusted coins bearing a flower in a spiral. Her last message to me was short. It's real. Not just Scotland, not just Europe. This thing is global. Then nothing. I never heard from her again. A month later, another man reached out. From Quebec, then another from Tasmania. Each with variations on the same story. 6 disappearances, 1 cycle, 13 steps, 1 spiral, and in every case, a root child returned. Quiet, different, unaging. Back in Scotland, a group of independent scholars published a restricted monograph. Its title, The Harvest Spiral, 13 Cycles of Living Containment. The introduction posited a chilling theory. Across every age and continent, the pattern recurs. It is not a religion. It is a mechanism. Children as vessels. Blood is preservation. Identity is sacrifice. Each 13th child becomes not the guardian, but the soil, and from that soil, control. Soon after, the authors of the monograph disappeared from public view. Their publisher denied the book had ever existed. I kept copies, 13 of them, hidden. I began to suspect the spiral wasn't just about ritual, it was about memory. A spiral winds inward, but it also winds forward. Those of us who learned the truth began to change. Our reflections lingered longer than they should. Our dreams synchronized. 13 of us, spread across continents, waking up from the same nightmare, always beginning in the altar room, always ending in silence. Somewhere, I believe, a new cycle is beginning, and I fear I've already planted its seed. I write these final words not as a warning, but as a confession. Not everything that grows is born in the light. Some roots thrive in darkness, watered not by rain, but by memory, ritual, repetition, and silence. And some names, even after being buried, continue to echo in the minds of those who never asked to remember. I was never just Michael Hartwell. That name was given, not earned. It was an anchor, tied to a house that waited patiently for its 13th root to return. I used to believe I had escaped, that by revealing the truth, by tearing open the soil, I could sever the spiral. But now, all these years later, I see it differently. The ritual was never meant to remain hidden. It was meant to be replanted. And we have done exactly that. Every person I contacted, every investigator who followed, every reader who opened those files, every listener who heard the name spoken aloud. The spiral blooms not through isolation, but through inheritance. Every time the story is told, it grows. And yet, what choice did I have? I remember each of their names now, not because I memorized them, but because they are part of me. Margaret, Edward, Sarah, Clara, Joseph, Thomas. I dream of their footsteps behind me in the hall, of their hands pressed against the stone, of their breath in the corners of the mirror when I dare to look too long. Some nights I hear them say my name, not with anger, not with sorrow, but with inevitability. Michael. Their voices always come in 13 whispers. On the 13th of each month I seal the windows. I scatter salt at the thresholds. I write their names on parchment, then burn it with black wax, hoping the smoke will confuse the spiral. But it never does. There are places I still dare not enter. There are mirrors I have shattered, only to find the reflection waiting behind the next pane of glass. Once I dreamed of a child with a stitched mouth, leading me by the hand into a field of petals. Each petal was a name, each name a scream. At the center, a spiral, carved into flesh, and beyond that silence, the kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something listening. You may think this was just a story. You may tell yourself it's a fiction, a tale spun from dust and death and guilt. But you already know better. You feel it now, don't you? The way the room shifted, the way a name you'd never heard before feels suddenly familiar. You've read the spiral. You've spoken it inward. Now ask yourself, who were the 13 before you, and who comes after? If this story touched something in you, if it stirred a memory, a shadow, a name that shouldn't be there, then I ask only this: do not forget them. Do not dismiss this as imagination, because forgetting is how it begins again. The spiral grows best in forgotten soil. And silence? Silence is always the first root. If this story has unsettled something deep inside you, don't let it end here. Like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel. There are other names that still need to be spoken, other cycles that beg to be broken, and perhaps, just perhaps, your voice might help stop the next bloom before it's too late.